impressed as an Air Force officer in the way you write this. I mean, I know that I keep finding myself thinking, well, we must have had a lot more airplanes than I remember in 1987 because you know they just keep popping up everywhere. Is there some kind of detectable bias in your writing toward an Air Force scenario?
Maybe to a point there is, yeah. We had a pretty big, sizable Air Force back in '87, and we had plans on the books to move as much as we could from the continental U.S. over to Europe as fast as we possibly could. So I think that when I was looking at those plans and I was trying to bring that into reality as far as what it would really be like, you know, there may have been a little more bias there. You know, the cavalry comes and saves the day. So air superiority is achieved. But I don't think that that's not really outside of the realm of possibility because we did have a much better Air Force. Well, NATO Air Forces overall were superior to the Pact. But the Russians and their allies just had a lot more numbers. So it was interesting to go and actually start to put that to the test in simulations and kind of see how that would work out. But so yeah, there may have been a little bit of a bias. So it's kind of. Oh, go ahead.
It leads into an interesting kind of a thought project because you look at from 87 to 2022, that's 35 years. And if you look at the 35 years prior to that, that would have been 1952 to 1987. I'm old enough. I remember 1987 very well. It was a great year. And you look at today at 2022, especially if you're going through the blog, you realize that a lot, especially on the Russian side, a lot of the equipment and in the U.S. side is the same. We don't have, a couple of our allies still have F-4s tooling around. But besides that, you've got a lot of the same equipment. Of course, geography doesn't change. Weather doesn't change. The essence of chance doesn't change all that much. And I know, especially in the last few months, the research and the things that you've realized while you're just talking about resupply and numbers, when you look at what's happening right now, whether on the Russian side or as U.S. and NATO starts to move things around, what are the things have you pointing at the TV or the computer screen and doing the Leonardo DiCaprio meme thing, going that right there? What really that's happening right now just makes you flash to the challenges that you saw looking at 1987?
It's amazing. Excuse me. When I look back at 1987, I realized that the Army had pretty much 2.5 corps already stationed in Europe. They were armor heavy, and they had the reforger sites, so they could bring in multiple divisions, bring the troops in, mate them up with the equipment, and they'd be available hopefully within a matter of days once the shooting starts. Fast forward to 2022, and we've got maybe, just in numbers at least, a division's worth of equipment in Europe. And that's pretty much just not going to do it. We've got one striker brigade, one airborne brigade, and in Poland, I think we have there's a heavy brigade that they rotate the troops in every so often. And, even if you would go back maybe 20 or 22 years ago, maybe to around 2000, we had 2 heavy brigades in Germany, and they would really come in pretty handy right now instead of bringing in 18th Airborne Corps, small numbers of 82nd Airborne troops and all of that. So even though back then we had a lot of plans on the books to reinforce Europe rather quick, we just don't have that now. And we're seeing, how much of a fallback that is, how much of a disadvantage that is. The Russians are putting 100,000 plus troops on their borders, and they're doing it pretty quick. And we just can't counter that right now. We've got nothing there to even hold the line until we can reinforce Europe. And then it becomes a question of, well, what do we reinforce Europe with? Then the Navy comes into the plans. You're going to might have to have a convoy system because the Russians still have some submarines. and there's just a whole number of variables to bring in. So it's interesting. Also, too, if I could, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Oh, you finish your thought, please.
Sure. One big difference between 87 and 22 is the lack of a doctrine for our military, our armed forces, and NATO overall. Like I said back then, the primary doctrine for the U.S. Army in Europe and for NATO, really, because they were there too, was Air-Land Battle 2000. There's really no doctrine or no defensive plan, to defend Europe from a threat from the East. And unfortunately, we're seeing that in some other areas too. There's really nothing for the Pacific either, and there's no excuse for that because we really should have seen what's happening there now. We should have seen that coming a long time ago. And it's just one of those shoulda, coulda, woulda things that might turn around to bite us in the rear one day pretty soon.
You're preaching to the choir. I think Sal and I have been discussing the issues with China for several years on this podcast, and a lot of other issues. I mean, you're in your. I know one of the things I kind of take some. What's the right word? I just found it interesting. Your ability to, in your blog, to get the convoys operating. I think maybe by day 9 or 10 or something, if even that long. That and it assumes a certain quantity of sea lift and a certain quantity of. This is 1987. And maybe we had it then. I don't remember. Although I should remember. I was working in convoy world in those days. Well, there was in the reserve. I went to reserves, the Naval Control of Shipping Organization.
Oh, there you go.
Which now is something else. Was all in the reserves. So yeah, we got to play with that stuff, and the reforger exercises and all that stuff. I mean, I think we tried one of those recently. I don't remember how that went, but.
I assume it took a while.
It's a problem, and that is one of those things. Now, Byron points out in the chat room that Desert Storm showed us that we had a problem in 1990, 1991 with sea lift, and we added some equipment to help ease that, but. You'd think we would have learned that we would need that capacity if we're going to do anything like reinforce Europe again or do anything in China. Now, so that being said, and I guess that's one of the things we should be taking a lesson from your work here. What are your thoughts on? I mean, you just gave a lot of them: sea lift and then sustainment of the forces. I mean, that's the other thing you deal with: logistics. Those are important issues.
Yeah, our sea lift capacity has really gone. I mean, you guys know it as well as I do, probably even more so. It's really gone downhill. So if we have to reinforce Europe very fast, it's not going to be done in a matter of days or even a couple of weeks. We're talking probably months to get those ships together, get the convoys together, and get them moving. And it could be an opposed crossing. There's no guarantee that it's going to be just a pleasure cruise across the Atlantic. So I don't know how much that's being taken into consideration in places like Newport or down in Washington. So I think that's one of those areas that definitely deserves a little more attention. As far as the Pacific goes, that's even a bigger problem. The Pacific's a big ocean. So if we're talking about getting, troops and equipment from places like Hawaii and the West Coast over to maybe Korea and areas like that, it's going to be a challenge, to say the very least. And it'll definitely be opposed over there. In Europe, there is maybe the possibility in the Atlantic, I should say. But once you're getting into the Western Pacific, nowadays, it's going to be an opposed crossing. So we really have to start preparing for that. I don't know if we are, to be honest.
I think it gets really scary really fast when math is hard. Math in wartime's harder. When you look at numbers and availability, I know we've had And I know he's listening to the show right here, so perk your ears up a little higher. Sal Mercogliano, we've had him, and John Conrad from G Captain on as well, talking about that exact challenge of an opposed crossing. And it's very frightening when you see some of the assumptions the U.S. Navy side of the house had towards some of the very few numbers of logistics ships that if the National Command Authority decides we need to reinforce Europe or reinforce the Pacific, and you can only get material there effectively one way, that's by sea. When you talk about an opposed crossing, you get maybe half a step into a war game, and things get really scary really fast. And I like how you said, people haven't really, thought about it. And I think that's one of the great values of what you've done the last half decade on looking at 87, because there are things that definitely translate here and today. And one thing I wanted to pull the thread on you, because when we look at what's happening in Europe right now, everybody's talking conventional, and that's great, and that's fine. And I've always looked at it that if we're lucky, the next conflict that comes to Europe, it will someday. That's just what history tells us. That hopefully nuclear weapons will be to that what chemical weapons were in the Second World War. But there's one scenario that on the naval side of the house that I believe it's about D+11 and D+10 you start writing about, is when NATO does what NATO will have to do, which is to go into Russia proper to hit logistics, hit air bases, and things of that manner, we put something the Russians value as much as we do, and that's our strategic deterrent and the ballistic missiles and going out to sea. And as an Air Force guy, even Navy guys who haven't looked at it, as an Air Force guy, as you looked at, especially when you read the 1986 Maritime Strategy and what that plan is, talk a little bit about even today, because wars have started for more stupid reasons and less logical reasons than anything that's happening right now, so I don't discount anything. In contemporary means, what are the lessons you learned about that particular aspect of the Russians' view of their strategic deterrence, safety in port versus at sea, and how, if things go sideways, people should think about that in the back of their head?
That's pretty interesting. In port, those strategic assets are really nothing more than targets. If you take those boomers and they're tied up to the quay, they're very vulnerable to air attack or a bunch of other very unpleasant possibilities. Once they're out in the sea and they're up in the bastion, they're protected. They've got minefields. They've got attack subs. They've got ASW groups mounted all up there to protect them and to keep them viable. So I think that that's something that for Russia and even for the United States, our power really comes from our ability to make war. And our nuclear weapons, pretty much the last line of defense. Without those, that's it. We're pretty much like we're not a superpower. So in the blog, the Russians recognized that pretty early on, and they let that be known to the U.S. and NATO. We're flushing our subs out. Don't attack them. Any attack against them is going to bring on a similar response. So, there have to be limits in any conflict. You can't just go buck wild in the Russians' backyard and target their, a big part of their nuclear forces and expect them to just kind of roll over and take it. It's not going to happen. So nowadays, though, I really think that, I hope that, nuclear weapons are just going to be taboo in any future conflict. I really can't see in any scenario NATO making first use of nuclear weapons. Whether it's to stop the Russians from overrunning Poland or even, taking over half of Germany. I just don't think that the alliance is united enough to even consider making those decisions. And we can't do it. We can't make that decision on our own as much as we might like to. So, there's a lot of food for thought there.
Well, I'd say the French might be tempted to nuke part of